Fair warning, this video is minor Super Metroid spoilers and major Symphony of the Night spoilers. Eponyms, a person, or in our case game, that transcended into being a commonly used word in modern language. Kind of like how we use Machiavellian to talk about anything twisted or cunning, Uber even when you call a Lyft, or Photoshop for any kind of picture editing. That's why the idea of Metroidvania is so appealing to me. What was it about Metroid Prime Pinball and Castlevania Puzzle, Encore of the Night, that created not just a genre, but a genre that sees itself pumping out a bevy of new games every year? Jokes aside, I'm gonna be honest, I've never played a Metroidvania before. I didn't even really start to play 2D games seriously until I got a Switch some time ago. I think I have a vague sense of what Metroidvanias are, 2D games with big sprawling maps that have players explore hidden passages and secrets to make progress. Don't take my word for it though. Let's see how our favorite encyclopedia defines them. A subgenre of action-adventure video games and platformers focused on guided non-linearity and utility-gated exploration and progression. There you have it. So in layman terms, instead of just taking a path from A to Z, we can take a path like P to O to G, and sometimes we open doors and stuff by getting cool keys and shit. With that PhD level analysis out of the way, I want to set the groundwork for what this video is trying to accomplish. Broadly, I want to see what Metroidvanias are all about and what it's like to get into them. What makes them tick, how much of it is Metroid and how much of it is Castlevania, if there even is a difference between the two, and when it's all wrapped up, give my take of what it's like to get into Metroidvanias. In particular, I'm curious to see how these games test my visual spatial ability. I suck at directions, and finding my way through places generally ends in disaster. My friends joke that I can get lost in an alleyway, and honestly, I can't disagree with them. It's a fun question for me to discover. Can I literally play these games? Well, there's only one way to find out, and what better way to start than where things began. I think it's cool to see what was up with the originals that ended up creating such a popular subgenre. Very early on, I got the sense of what the Metroid formula is like. Here I get the Morph Ball, and that immediately unlocks more paths for me. Same happened when I got the bombs. Playing through it, I was honestly surprised how well some of the aspects hold up. Strolling around looking for secrets is remarkably not terrible for a game nearing 40 years old. Right off the bat, I was doing my best to make maps in my head, thinking of places that I might want to visit as I got more options to explore. That's where the praise ends though. The combat and general platforming really is a product of its time, and its clunkiness and limitation. In particular, not being able to crouch and shoot really hinders the experience. The traversal also isn't that fun at some points either, falling more in line with being annoying than challenging like some other hard 2D platformers are. And that's the first point that got me. It's going to be really hard to enjoy a Metroidvania, no matter how well thought out and intricate the map is, if it's not fun to actually move around. At a certain point, I just called it quits. I don't think I'm missing out on much if I don't finish Metroid, when Super Metroid is the game that really put the series on the map. I got a starter of what the genre might look like. Non-linear exploration, a focus on detailing maps out in my head, and finding upgrades to progress to certain places I couldn't otherwise. Since I frankly didn't get too far into Metroid, I can't say for certain whether my mental map making ability was tested, but I can at least say I wasn't overwhelmed quite yet, which I'm proud of. When it comes to Castlevania, the first game was just a typical side-scrolling platformer. No non-linear progression to be seen. It wasn't until Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, that players get to explore. And well, in regards to Castlevania 2, I don't think I've ever felt more lost in a game than in Simon's Quest. Old lady tells me to go buy a white crystal, I have no money, I go exploring, only to find myself back in the city and just, ugh. It's slow, sluggish, and most of all, unintuitive. Metroid at least had a means of guiding the player into where to go with the level design. It never gave hints, but just the way the levels laid out made it clear where I at least should take a look at. And even though I wasn't a fan of the platforming in the first Metroid, Castlevania 2 makes Samus's first outing feel like a Mario game. But don't take my word for it. Listen to the main man himself.
This game is the unholy fuckness.
Crucially, I don't think either of these NES games are necessary for this deep dive. After all, it wasn't until Symphony of the Night that the blueprint for Metroidvanias became something that people started to iterate on. So if you'll forgive me, let's jump a few generations into something a little more palatable. One more time. There it is. And right from the get-go, this game is a joy to play compared to its 8-bit grandmother. 8-directional shooting, reasonable enemy counts, and the pixel work is just superb for a game nearing 3 decades. The difference between the level design from the original Metroid is stark. Early on, I was reminded of how the first game operated. Find power-ups like the Morph Ball or bombs to enter previously inaccessible paths, while keeping an eye out for possible secret passages that aren't obvious. The addition of a map was extremely helpful. Even though in the beginning, before I got map unlocks, it only showed me places that I've been to before, it made navigation and backtracking so much easier. And on that note, let's discuss backtracking. From the previous games I played, backtracking is a bit of an accursed word, usually used as a means to rail a game for extending its playtime without adding any new content, but in the case of a game like this, I personally think it's part of the fun. Even if it was a means to make the game longer, it wasn't without a purpose. Backtracking in Super Metroid reinforces a dopamine-filled discovery loop of being blocked, finding a way to upgrade, then discovering hidden passageways with your newly enhanced character. In terms of palpable upgrades to Samus herself, the closest thing I can think of is expanding the carrying capacity of her auxiliary weapons. Having extra missiles and the like were always useful, especially for boss fights, but the zone-to-zone combat was never enough of a challenge that I felt like I needed to dig around and get as many upgrades as possible. Throughout my time, I made sure to scrutinize every part of the world, leaving no pixel unturned as it could have been key to progressing through the game. I was a bit shocked at how many times I wasn't all that stuck throughout the game, something I attribute more to the world design than me suddenly becoming an expert mapper. But with that said, I did notice that how I process new locations changed from the start to the end of the game. I started thinking more in terms of paths than map coordinates, especially in the start of the game, as getting map upgrades pretty much acted as a crutch for getting around. Not everything was perfect with Super Metroid though. Given its age, there was a sense of rigidness with the platforming, and the combat just seemed to exist for the sake of existing rather than adding a significant dimension to the game. Again, the game is practically 30 years old, so I'm not trying to compare it to a modern 2D game, but it's still something I couldn't help but notice. While the enemies themselves felt kinda lackluster, the boss fights were actually pretty fun, requiring timing, shooting, and pattern recognition. Overall, I'm actually kinda proud of my time with Super Metroid. As an initiation to the Metroidvania formula, I wasn't completely overwhelmed all the time, and while the game isn't perfect, particularly in the combat and platforming, I was just having a blast knowing that after this, I have 30 years of evolving games to sink my teeth into. And really, that's all there is to say. Super Metroid, my first Metroidvania. With my hazing out of the way, I'm ready to see what the second pairing of the genre is with Symphony of the Night. The main question I have going in is whether Super Metroid and Castlevania fundamentally had different genes that mixed in into creating the Metroidvania formula, or if they're two of the same dishes made by different restaurants. That's to say, are modern Metroidvanias some part Metroid and some part Castlevania, or are they just similar games with a cool name when you mix them in? Well, without further ado, let's jump in. Anyway, I was immediately taken aback at how the game looked. Whereas Super Metroid had a very reptilian sci-fi feel, the gothic fantasy setting was really interesting. The combat, especially to begin with, was a lot of fun. Super Metroid's combat mostly just existed, and fortunately didn't take away from the better parts of the game, but with Symphony I was genuinely excited to walk into a room and slash away. There was also a major difference with progression in Castlevania in that there was a leveling system, unlike Metroid. I wasn't able to feel an immediate impact as I got stronger, but one thing that I can say for certain is that the game got a lot easier as I progressed. Though part of it is that I spent a lot of money on the Damascus sword early on, and that was useful until the end of the game. In Metroid, I got stronger by getting more missiles and more tools to mess around with, but in Castlevania, a mix of better weapons, leveling, and heart upgrades actually made the game pretty easy by the end. Platforming wise, it felt good too, though I wish Alucard could have traversed faster than having to moonslide all the time. Now in terms of exploration, the skeleton was pretty similar to Super Metroid, but with different meat. Metroid had a big emphasis on finding secrets, usually through bombing, morphing, and sprinting, i.e. upgrades to enable further traversal, while Castlevania certainly had that. Particularly with its wolf, mist, and bat transformations, it mostly fell under the Dark Soulsy method of opening up a door that was previously inaccessible, rather than constantly hunting for secret areas I can break into. That's not to say there were hidden paths or unobvious ways of getting around though. Oh boy there were. And that leads me to talk about the most taboo subject someone can discuss on YouTube, using guides in Metroidvanias. After I defeated Richter, I thought there would be some cutscene to tell me where to go next, but instead I was greeted with a credits roll.
What the fuck?
This couldn't have been right. The whole point of the game was to beat Dracula. And I knew enough Castlevania lore from YouTube to know that Richter wasn't actually a bad guy. What gives? At this point, I swallowed my pride and I looked at a guide. I looked online and I found out this wasn't the true ending. In fact, I needed to find not one but 2 rings hidden in the world to get goggles to see past some sort of illusion. Honestly, I never would have figured this out myself. Even Super Metroid's trickier puzzles could have been deduced with enough situational awareness, but this was pure luck at best. Now, I know the optics of me complaining about not finding something in a game predicated about finding stuff isn't great, and I take full responsibility for my shortcomings, but it made me think about what the role of Metroidvanias in the time of the internet are supposed to be. Generally, I've been coddled by open world games holding my hand even when I didn't need them to, meaning that I haven't been in need of a guide for quite some time. The last game that I got external help from was Elden Ring through my friends, and that social learning aspect of it actually enriched my experience more than figuring things out myself. But in a Metroidvania where the goal is to discover the map by yourself, it left a sour taste in my mouth to know that I couldn't have been able to complete it alone. If I grew up in a time without the internet, would I have been better primed to find the keys out myself? Maybe the way I grew up playing games left a blind spot for discovering these things. If I had a semblance of a clue that I needed these keys, I could have happily done some more digging. But alas, I didn't, and I realized I had a lot more to learn than I thought. At this point, I was pretty done with Symphony of the Night. What was shaping up to be a really fun experience just ended too awkwardly for me to get back into it. Still, I had a lot of fun with the game. And much like Super Metroid, what was really exciting to me was the prospect of the treasure trove of more refined Metroidvanias out there. The joy of finding new rooms and new toys to play with is something I'm grateful to experience in a video game. The two games were similar enough for me to say the term Metroidvania isn't really a hybrid combination of the two, more so than a cool sounding callback to the OGs. I learned my lessons with these two games. Don't get too comfortable, don't trust everything the game shows me at face value, and always stay curious. All I can say is, I'm super excited to take these lessons I learned onto the next game, Story of Caves. Stay tuned.